Wow, hello and good evening from a rather chilly and dreek Highlands. We've had such a beautiful week here up until this morning, and I woke up uh, and looked out the window, and the murk and clag was down around the mountains, and there's a definite chill in the air. And in fact, the weather forecasters are forecasting some snow on our highest peaks over the weekend. I'm Andrew Baxter. I'm a professional guide who's privileged to not only live but work in the Scottish Highlands, welcoming guests from all around the world. If you haven't been along to one of these virtual tours before, a very warm welcome indeed. It's great to see so many people joining me from around the world whilst we all cope with the coronavirus lockdown in one way or another. And I will continue with these weekly photo tours until travel restrictions are lifted and we can get moving again in the Scottish Highlands, and I can welcome guests on tour in person. So first of all, I want to make a really big shout out to two guests in particular. So a big welcome to Carol, who's joining us from Cape Town, and also to her partner, Per, who's in Gothenburg in beautiful Sweden. They're separated by thousands of miles at the moment, but they're coming together to watch the virtual tour this evening. So a big welcome to both of you and to everyone else who's managed to join us this evening. So the theme of this week's tour is a journey along the Great Glen. Fantastic part of Scotland. In fact, I live just a few miles away from the start of the Great Glen, right down in the southwest of that particular line. But before I get onto the presentation, I forgot one thing. Well, two things, first of all, because I know there's lots of speculation about my tipple each week. So last week and the week before, I had opted for some beer. Well, I'm back to Ushka Var, the water of life this evening. I've got a little dram of Glen Murray. So I don't know if you have a tipple wherever you are, or maybe just a good old-fashioned cup of tea. But we have a saying here in the Highlands, which is Slanjavar, your very good health. That will keep me going over the next hour. And the second thing is, many of you would have seen the little chat bar on the right-hand side of the screen. Do please introduce yourselves there. It's lovely to see who is joining us. And then at the bottom of the screen, underneath me, is an open question area. It's a lot easier to put your questions there because I can timestamp them, and anyone who's following the replay of this video later on can jump to exactly the point that I answer any particular questions. So let's get going. Back onto the Great Glen. It's this huge geological gash that separates Scotland from the north and the south. And there we are, a good map showing it. So that the strong purple line that you can see stretching from the southwest of the Highlands up to the northeast. So it connects the Atlantic Ocean with the North Sea on the other side of Inverness. And in fact, is one of the world's major geological fault lines even today. It's still an active earthquake zone. So we probably have somewhere in the region of 200 to 300 earthquakes every year. And I say earthquakes, well, most of the time they will go unnoticed. They're only recorded by the British Geological Survey. So they're really earth tremors, quite minor on global terms. And probably the most we'll ever notice is a deep rumble, a bit like a loud clap of thunder, and maybe a slight vibration, and maybe one or two loose slates on our roof, but nothing more serious. It barely makes a ripple on your cup of tea. And that's important, this earthquake zone, this fault line, because it's what formed the Great Glen. Around about 400 million years ago, there was an enormous upheaval in the Earth's crust, and it shifted the north side of Scotland from the south side by about 65 miles. And you can see that diagonal line there where everything's gone somewhat askew. And since then, through the various ice ages, it's been scoured out by enormous glaciers, leaving this shallow-bottomed glen, forming a line across the country, and the waters have filled in behind that. And so across the entire length of the glen, we have 4 lochs. So down in the southwest here, we have Loch Linnhe, that flows out into the Atlantic Ocean past Oban and the Isle of Mull. Then we go into Loch Linnhe, which is a bit of a nonsense because it's the Loch of the Lochs, Loch Linnhe, Loch Oich, and then the famous Loch Ness, possibly the most famous of all the lochs in the whole of Scotland. And eventually the waters of Loch Ness flow through Inverness and out into this part of the North Sea here that we can see up in the top right-hand corner of the screen, which is known as the Moray Firth. There's a road that runs along the entire length of the Great Glen today called the A82, important trunk road. But travellers have been taking this route for probably thousands of years. One of the earliest recordings of a journey along the Great Glen is of a Celtic saint called Saint Columba, who headed to Inverness to convert the local Pictish king, one of the kings of the local tribes that dominated much of Scotland at the time, to Christianity. And maybe we might touch upon Saint Columba a little later on when we get to Loch Ness. So our first stop today is right down in that southwest corner, a place called the Corran Narrows. This is actually on Loch Linnhe, about 10 miles south of Fort William. And the loch here is at its narrowest point. Quite a fierce, a rapid tidal race goes through the narrows here, which at the narrowest are probably about less than 400 meters across. And I'm told that during spring tides, the speed of the currents going through the narrows here can reach anywhere between 3.5 and 4 knots. So it can be a little bit tricky, I'm told, for some mariners to get through, and that's why there's this little lighthouse still sat there on the narrows today on the what we call the Ardna Merkin side of the narrows, which is a big peninsula that comes down from further north. It has a real island feel about it, though, and the lighthouse is there. It's built by the famous Stevenson brothers, and one of those brothers was the father of a really well-known Scottish author, Robert Louis Stevenson. So if you've ever read the book Kidnapped, and if you haven't, I really recommend it, Kidnapped, written by Robert Louis Stevenson, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as well, one of his famous works. And it's his father and uncle that built many of the lighthouses around the coast of Scotland, and they're still there today. Although no longer, unfortunately, with a lighthouse keeper. It's fully automated now, and I believe it's been turned into a holiday home. So if you're tempted to visit Scotland once the travel restrictions are lifted, then maybe the lighthouse at Ardgow on the Corran Narrows could be the place for you to head. You can see Loch Linnhe stretching off into the distance there for, as I say, about another 10 miles towards Fort William. It's an interesting loch, and if you were to visit it, you may see some boats out on the loch that look a bit like rather old, tired car ferries, and they're part of an international underwater diving school. So trainee divers from across the world, particularly those that are working on oil and gas rigs, come here to train because the loch is a good place, good and deep in sheltered water for them to put down their submersibles and practice their work at the bottom of a Loch Linnhe. Very skilled job. I'm told that if you're a fully trained deep sea diver that come out of this school, you can command £3,000 or £4,000 a day for your skills and your time. So Loch Linnhe may look quite remote and quite sheltered and quite sleepy, but it's interesting to know that there are men and women across the world diving under our oceans that spent their training time here on Loch Linnhe. So we're going to head up right to the head of the loch now. And that photo was taken by me 2 summers ago from the pier in Fort William on one of those really still sunny days. There was barely a ripple of wind, just a slight shimmer to the loch there, but I was particularly taken by how beautiful that mirror image was, particularly stunning in my opinion. Really nice light day there. So that's from Fort William, the second biggest or the first biggest town after Inverness in the Highlands, around about 10,000 people, right at the very head of Loch Linnhe. And behind me in this shot, and it's difficult for any town to compete with a beautiful location like that, and that's why I focused on that particular scenery rather than Fort William itself. And we're going to head just a little bit further along the loch now, right to the very head of the loch. And I wanted to show you this photo because although we're going to head to the summit of Ben Nevis very soon, if you ever visit Fort William and you're on the look for Britain's tallest mountain, Ben Nevis, then it's actually quite difficult to see it from the town. If you look across the loch, you might be able to just make out below this ridge coming in from the right-hand side of the photo, some little white spots. Well, that's the town of Fort William itself. And then the snow-peaked cap with the clouds just touching its very summit is Ben Nevis. And you're the lower hills of Ben Nevis in the foreground there from the town means because of the perspective, you can't actually see the summit of Ben Nevis. And many people, I'm sure, come to Fort William looking for it. Quite often it's under the cloud anyway, and they go away disappointed because they haven't been able to see it. And you just need to go a few miles out of the town and you get spectacular views across Loch Linnhe back to the Ben itself. And this is one of my favorite, this old hulk of a beach fishing boat that was washed up on the shore many years ago and never reclaimed or moved. And it's a rusting hulk now and a popular photo spot, and you can see exactly why with that fantastic view in the background. I'm going to just head away from Loch Linnhe now to the village that is right close to this particular spot. You can see at the bottom of the screen there, a place called Banavie. And Banavie is where something called the Caledonian Canal flows out into Loch Linnhe. And again, it's one of the best places to find a view of Ben Nevis, again clad in the snow there. Not uncommon, Ben Nevis being covered in snow, so it's quite unusual to see it on a sunny day like this in the middle of winter. And as I said, we're right at the beginning of the Caledonian Canal, an amazing feat of Scottish engineering. So this was constructed, started work on it in 1803, and eventually it was opened to boats in 1822. It runs for 60 miles from just outside Fort William all the way up to Inverness, with 22 of those miles are being artificial canal work, and the rest of it linking up those lochs that I mentioned, Linnhe, Loch Linnhe, and Loch Ness. And like most British infrastructure projects, it was hopelessly over budget. It was hopelessly behind schedule, even though it opened in 1822. It wasn't for another 25 years that it was finally complete. And by that time, it was obsolete. And it must have made the man who designed it and oversaw much of its work, a man called Thomas Telford, that if you had been on one of my previous virtual tours, you might have heard of before, known as the Colossus of Rhodes for the amount of bridges and roads he built in Scotland. He conceived this idea, and he must have been very troubled by the lack of progress and all the obstacles that had been put in his way. And one of the reasons it was built was to create work for the Highlanders at a time of economic depression. It was a way of keeping them occupied as well. And also with a view to what Napoleon was doing over the continent and the threats that he was posing to Britain, they built the canal as a shortcut across the Highlands to allow naval frigates to move from one side to another. But the problem is that once it was completed, naval ship design and technology had steamed ahead, in fact, to the steamship era, and all the loch gates that were constructed along the canal were now too narrow for any of the naval frigates to pass through. And this is possibly one of the most amazing sights on the canal itself, known as Neptune's Staircase. It's a series of 8 lochs that rise about 20 meters, which I think is about 65 feet, something like that, over a distance of around 500 meters, which is around 450 yards. So 8 lochs in total, allowing the boat traffic to come down from the highest point down to the lowest, ready to go out to sea. And all designed by Thomas Telford. An amazing sight. Really impressive to see the boats go through there. And as I say, they were originally designed to allow passage for a naval frigate, and then in no time at all, they were no longer needed. So we're going to press on from Neptune's Staircase. We're going to revisit the Caledonian Canal when we get about halfway up the Great Glen and we get to Fort Augustus. So we're going to zoom through the next photo of Neptune's Staircase. There you are. You can see we're at the top there, looking back down towards Loch Linnhe. with the lock gates going off in the distance. And we'll come back to Ben Nevis, the poisonous or terrible hill. Many Gaelic scholars think is the derivative of its name. And it can't be that terrible because it attracts around about 100,000 people every year who climb to its summit. Now, on global terms, it's a mere minnow. It's around about, it's 1,345 meters high, which is 4,411 feet. So not particularly high at all. But when you consider that every single one of those meters you have to climb from sea level all the way to the summit, it is still a mighty mountain to climb. And it catches out people every year. We have people that have to be rescued by the local mountain rescue team. Because we're on the coast here at Ben Nevis, the weather can change extremely rapidly. We have a saying in the Highlands, you can experience all 4 seasons in one day, and you can certainly do that on Ben Nevis. And at the very top, the summit is surrounded by really precipitous crags. And when you consider there is cloud cover for 2 out of every 3 days, and if you get caught up there in a whiteout, or when the weather has deteriorated and you don't know how to use a map and compass, you can find yourself stuck on those crags, needing the help of the brave team of volunteers based in Fort William, who head out into the mountains to rescue those in trouble. And I thought I would include a photo from the summit cairn to save you the trouble of climbing every one of those meters to the very top. And that's looking back down to the top of Loch Linnhe there, and looking out to the westwards towards the Isle of Skye. I think the haze is a bit too much to actually see the island in that photo. And if you were to come to Scotland at the beginning of September, you might be tempted to seek a place in the annual Ben Nevis race, when competitors from across the world set off from Fort William, and they run to the very top, turn around, having touched that summit cairn, and then run all the way back to Fort William. It's a distance of 8.7 miles, and the winner does it in around about 1 hour and 25 minutes. And in fact, it's a local man, a local doctor who works in the medical centre in Fort William, Dr. Finlay Wild, who is the current champ, and he has been for the last 10 years. Quite extraordinary. We have a specific Scottish word for people that enter the Ben Nevis race. They are called idiots, or extremely brave, because they really do fling themselves off the mountain when they head back down the hillside. So maybe you'd like to do a Google search and see some of the videos that are available on YouTube to see exactly what the race includes. And we're just heading outside the town now to Inverlochy Castle, which is really the original start of Fort William. This was the centre of Fort William before even Fort William was constructed. It's the castle at the mouth of the Lochie. It was built by a powerful family called the Cummins in the 13th century. And it was built here because of its strategic position, guarding the entrance to the Great Glen. And then it's seen a couple of important battles at this spot. Two battles, one in 1431, when King James I was controlling the castle, and he was taking on the might of the powerful MacDonald clan, the Lords of the Isles, who sailed up Loch Linnhe and launched a three-pronged attack, and that resulted in the death of at least 1,000 of the king's men. And James I gave up any thought of reining in the unruly MacDonalds and trying to quell their power on the west coast of Scotland. And then again in 1645, the Second Battle of Inverlochy, and this time royalist armies were stationed here in Fort Augustus up the Great Glen. The Campbells were stationed here, and the royalist forces marched through the mountains 30 miles in 36 hours, right through the middle of really frozen, treacherous weather, and they launched another surprise attack on the Campbells that were based here, and were told at least 1,500 were slaughtered during that particular battle. And Inverlochy Castle today is almost forgotten. It's a little off the main road with just a small sign pointing people in that direction. But if you wanted to get a real feeling for the might of the clans in the 13th century who were able to build a castle, a defensive fortress like this, it's certainly a place to visit. And once again, it's a good spot to get some lovely views of Ben Nevis itself. And we're going to head on up the Great Glen. I wanted to include this photo. We're just outside the village of Spean Bridge, and it seemed appropriate to put this photo up today because we are remembering in the United Kingdom and in many other countries around the world, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, the 75th anniversary of the cessation of hostilities in Europe. And this statue, this monument, the Commando Memorial, erected in 1952 and unveiled by the Queen Mother, remembers this part of Scotland's role in winning the Second World War, because men who were already serving in the military, in the army, the air force, or the navy, who were viewed as being the elite of the elite, were recruited to Winston Churchill's new top secret elite fighting force. He wanted to wage a different type of war on continental Europe. It needed a different breed of warriors. And these men were put on a train in London the night before, and they journeyed all the way through the night, and they got off at the little station in Spean Bridge with their full kit, which they were carrying, an assault rifle, and they had to get the 7 miles from the station to the Commando training headquarters in Achnacarry Castle, 7 miles across pretty rough terrain, as you can see in the background. And they had 60 minutes and no more to do so. And if they arrived at their training camp 1 second over those 60 minutes, they were given a slip of paper that simply had the initials RTU written on them. They were turned around and marched back to Spean Bridge Station, where a train was waiting to return them to their unit, because that's what RTU stood for, return to unit. They had failed the very first test of becoming a commando, and they spent their time training in this area from 1942 onwards, and that's why this statue is here. They were joined by fellow servicemen from other Allied forces, from the United States and from Czechoslovakia and Poland as well, amongst many other Allied nations. And it's a fitting statue. There they are, 3 of the men standing in full uniform, looking back down towards the station where they had disembarked. And I think I've got a bit of a close-up there of the three men, and just off the shot, just off the screen here, we have the saying underneath their boots that says, "United we conquer." So quite a fitting and appropriate tribute to those men that many of them made the supreme sacrifice in the events that we are remembering around the world today. I'm just going to speed through these particular photos because I'm slightly behind schedule. But this is Achnacarry Castle down the glen from that particular memorial. You can just see through the trees there the castle. This is the home of Clan Cameron. The clan chief Cameron of Loch Linnhe still resides in this particular country house today. They're an interesting clan because they came out in favour of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobites. So they were fighting against the British Army in the 1700s. And then after the Battle of Culloden in 1746, time moved on and the Camerons became very much part of the British establishment. And the Cameron Highlanders, which was a locally formed Highland regiment, were some of the bravest fighting soldiers in the British Army, and they saw action at many of the key battles in both the First World War and also the Second World War. And the castle was requisitioned as the Commando headquarters during the Second World War. And you can see that they had very much became part of the establishment because that's the old stable block that was built on the estate once the then chief of the Camerons had found fortune after the events of Culloden. And that's now a very nice set of holiday apartments that you can stay in. So we're on to a new loch along the Great Glen now. This is just that little strip of water in the background. There is Loch Linnhe. And again, this is one of those things that people zoom past on the way to Inverness or Fort William. This monument called the Well of the Seven Heads is right next to the road, but probably most people miss it. And they were already past it before they noticed it. And it's a stone obelisk erected in the 1800s. And we're going to have a closer look at exactly what is at the top and the reason why. So there's a hand with a dagger, and it's also holding 7 severed heads beneath the dagger. And this links back to a gruesome part of clan history where the different wings of the Clan Donald, the mighty MacDonalds, were at war with each other. And it's a reminder of the events that took place on the 25th of September 1663, when Alexander, the 13th chief of the Keppoch Donalds, and his brother Ranald were brutally murdered by their cousins. Now, these two men had been sent off for schooling in France, and they had travelled around Europe. They had learnt several European languages. They had learnt about art and European history. They were extremely refined men, not like the normal clansmen of the 1600s Scottish Highlands. And when they returned, a huge party had been put on to welcome them home. And in no time at all, their fellow clansmen, I suspect rather jealous about these two brothers, mocked their French accents and their strange mannerisms. And this mocking soon turned into an argument that became a full and bloody fight. And at the end of it, Alexander and Ranald had died at the hands of their cousin, Alexander MacDonald, and his 6 sons. Now, normally, within Highland clans, revenge would be extremely quick and expected, but it didn't happen on this occasion, and people must have thought no justice was going to be meted out. But there was one man determined to make sure that the brothers' deaths were avenged, and this was Ian Lom, the Bard of Keppoch, a romantic poet who wanted retribution. So he headed to the wider clan, to Lord MacDonald of Glengarry, who refused to get involved. And he wasn't prepared to give up, so he headed to Sir James MacDonald of Slate, who was hesitant to get involved in this matter. He viewed it as a problem for the rest of the family to deal with. But Ian Lom travelled all the way to Skye, to the chief's castle, and he appealed in poetry for the revenge of the brothers' deaths. And eventually what is called a letter of fire and sword was issued, which meant that the government had sanctioned the killing of the perpetrators. And things caught up with them. And they were killed in their farmhouse not far across the hills from here. MacDonald and his 6 sons, and they were decapitated. And Ian Lom wrapped their heads in plaid, tied them to willow, and carried them to Loch Oich, where he paused and washed their heads in the lochside water before presenting them to Glengarry as a reminder that Glengarry had refused to come to his aid. So it's a memory of this particularly bloody episode in Scottish clan history that we have the monument to the Well of the 7 Heads a little way up the Great Glen. So we're going to carry on a little way now, a little further to Fort Augustus, and there we are. I realized that I really didn't have many photos of Fort Augustus on offer. So what I thought I would do is try something a little bit new this evening and have a sort of Google walkthrough of Fort Augustus for a few minutes. Now, you may think that's an odd view that I've chosen there of a hotel. And the reason I've started here is to show you the very last bit of the original Fort Augustus that stands. Where the little pointer is on the left-hand side, you might just be able to work out a little bit of a stone wall there, several meters high. And that's all that's left of a once mighty fort where the Duke of Cumberland stationed himself during the Jacobite uprisings of 1745. And we're going to head away from that fort now, down the road a bit closer to the loch side, and in amongst the trees there is the remains of a Benedictine abbey. Don't worry, we're going to get a closer look of that at in a moment's time. But first of all, we're going to head into the village itself. We're right in the centre here. That building that we can see that says the Mill Shop is in fact an old church called a tin tabernacle, built out of corrugated tin. It was one of the early flat packs that you could buy in the 1800s from a company in Glasgow. Came on the back of a cart. You took the pieces off and you erected your church at a time when a Christian revival was going across the whole of the Highlands. And we're stood on a swing bridge right in the centre of Fort Augustus, now over the top of the Caledonian Canal. And we're just going to swing round so you can get a bit of a closer look there. There you are. Some more lock gates, a bit like those down in Bannerby at Neptune's staircase. And we're going to see if we can get a little bit closer to the lock. Now, earlier I said that it had been obsolete when it opened and it fell into a bit of disuse. And then it was popularized in the 1800s by Queen Victoria, who came on a boat journey along the Caledonian Canal, and wherever Queen Victoria went, everyone else in fashionable society wanted to go, and the Caledonian Canal suddenly became a popular tourist destination with steamships heading up from Glasgow, travelling the whole length all the way to Inverness. And there you are, your first glimpse of the Loch Ness monster, used as one of the flower displays here on the Caledonian Canal in Fort Augustus. So a little bit of a closer look there. And then I think we're going to hopefully head through to the centre of the Benedictine Abbey. Just waiting for that now. The monks there, it's said that they had the very first hydroelectric power station anywhere in Scotland in the late 1800s to generate electricity for the abbey. There we are in the centre quad with the cloisters around all four sides. It later became a school, and today it's no longer either an abbey or a school, but a rather upmarket timeshare complex called the Highland Club, with rather expensive holiday apartments that you can have a timeshare in. And we're just going to head away from the Abbey there for your first glimpse of Loch Ness itself. A rather dreary and gloomy day there on Loch Ness, and we're just going to swing around so you can get a sense as to why the monks chose that particular spot for their abbey, right on the banks of Loch Ness. Going to spin around a bit more. There you are. Yeah, you can see the abbey and the abbey tower with the set of steps that the monks must have walked down during moments of solitude to escape the abbey complex and walk along the side of Loch Ness. So I hope you enjoyed that quick sojourn through Fort Augustus. Got a little bit of a flavour for the place. We're going to head back to the centre of Fort Augustus and further up the Great Glen on our journey. And we're going to have a brief stop around 10 miles from Fort Augustus, a place called Invermoriston. And this is one of my favourite spots. The River Moriston and some rather impressive rapids and waterfalls flow through here. You can see the rocky defile there under the bridge. The water was particularly low when I took this photo, so you don't really get the full impact. But when it's the river's in spate, this is a popular place to come, and maybe just under the arch of the bridge, may be able to work out a structure in the distance. We'll get a closer look at that now. This little building is up above the rocks, built by the local landowning family. It's what we call a folly, and he built it as a place for his children to have picnics in the summer months. A rather nice spot for a picnic, I'm sure, above the river Moriston. A lovely spot, and it's what rich people and the landed gentry did, not just across Scotland, but across the whole of the United Kingdom. Particularly popular during the Victorian era. If they had a bit of spare cash to splash, they'd build structures like this, right, really to show off to their neighbours. And there we are, looking back from the new bridge to the old bridge, and this is one of those bridges built by the famous Thomas Telford. The original road used to run across here, built in the early 1800s as part of a road that he built along much of the length of Loch Ness. Which seems appropriate that we go and talk about Loch Ness, and let's see if we can get a view of possibly Scotland's most famous loch. It's a lovely view there. It's deeper than the North Sea, probably around about, on average, 750 feet deep, although recent sonar surveys by one of the Loch Ness monster spotting boats that head up and down the loch found a recording just outside Urquhart Castle that they suggest that it was over 800 feet deep, but that hasn't been verified, and the map makers say that they are not going to undertake any official survey to figure out whether that was true. Others suggest that it might be even deeper, at least 1,000 feet, particularly in the castle area where it's thought there are some underwater caves there. And although it's not the largest loch in Scotland or the longest loch, it is the loch with the largest volume of water anywhere in our country. In fact, it's so large you could fit all the water from every lake in England and Wales into Loch Ness and still have spare room to top it up with even more water. And although the temperature at the surface fluctuates, the temperature lower down is at a constant temperature, around about 7 degrees Celsius. And so as a result, even in the harshest of winters, the loch never freezes, which may explain why it could be the site of the famous Loch Ness monster, Nessie herself. And thank you to Carol for these photos that date back 32 years. There you are. You can see a ticket for Loch Ness Youth Hostel there from the summer of 1988. Carol says that she had a quick trip to Loch Ness en route to the Isle of Skye, and this wooden Loch Ness monster here in the foreground looking over the loch. It's one of her favourite photos from that particular journey. Thank you very much indeed, Carol, for sharing that with us. So I'm not actually going to talk a great deal about the Loch Ness monster this week because I'm going to actually do an entire tour around Loch Ness next week. So maybe we'll talk about it a bit more then. But to say that the modern sightings date back from the 1930s, and a particular famous photo called the Surgeon's photo appeared, and it resulted in Nessie mania, with newspapers from around the world sending reporters there to see if they could get a photo of the elusive monster. And ever since, we've been welcoming people who are determined to catch a sight of Nessie. There's been a few sightings this year, I am told. And well, I've stood on the lochs of Loch Ness many occasion, and I can see why you might think that you've caught sight of the Loch Ness monster. The light and the water moves in a particular way, and you stand there and you think, is that something that I'm seeing in the distance? And you're never really quite sure what you're seeing, whether it's a trick of the light or was it something that had appeared from underneath the water. And I guess we may never really know the secrets of Loch Ness. Scientists from around the world keep on coming. We had scientists 2 summers ago that had come up with a new technique of extracting DNA samples from water, and they were thinking that they could identify other new species that had never been caught or sighted because of the depth of the loch. And last summer, the lead scientists came back and said that the DNA samples that they found revealed that there was some type of giant eel that resided in the loch, and that was their supposition that that's really what the Loch Ness monster was. There we are. That's Urquhart Castle. Rather fine shot of the ruins there, about midway along Loch Ness. And as I think I said a bit earlier, some of the deepest points of the loch are just off the shore here. So this is a particularly popular place for Nessie sightings. People will come here and look out, or maybe go on one of the boat trips that head out from further up the loch and come down to the bay by Urquhart Castle with the hope of seeing the monster herself. And I think what we'll do is we'll look a bit closer at Urquhart Castle next week, except to say here that there's been some sort of fortification on this spot since at least the Iron Age. The original castle, the oldest parts that's still on the site today, date back from the 13th century. And then the tower that we can see in the middle of the picture there is the Grant Tower from the 16th century. It's one of the most popular visitor attractions in Scotland, certainly the most popular in the Highlands, and it's in the care of a state organisation called the Historic Environment Scotland. Well worth a visit if you head to Loch Ness in the future, although I can't guarantee that you'll have such a beautiful sunny day as we see in this particular photograph. So we're going to head up. Oh, I was going to say we're going to head up Loch Ness to Inverness. There you are. I couldn't resist putting a photo of Loch Ness and Nessie herself in for you. If only that was a real photo, I would be a millionaire now, having sold it as evidence to the world's media. But alas, I can't verify the true veracity of the creature that we see there in that particular photo. So we're going to head up to the very top of Loch Ness now. We've left it behind. We're towards the end of the Great Glen. This is the River Ness flowing through the centre of Inverness. A really pleasant river side town. A city today, made a city in the year 2000, in the millennium year. And again, I'm not going to dwell in Inverness. 2 weeks' time, fortnight today, I'm going to do a particular tour of Inverness itself. But because it sort of bookends the Great Glen with Fort William at one end and then Inverness at the other, I thought it would be remiss if I didn't include a photograph from Inverness itself. And then just a little way outside of the city, we've now into something called the Moray Firth. It's this body of water which the River Ness flows into, and then the Moray Firth heads out to the North Sea. And up until the early 1980s, if you were heading north from Inverness up towards John O'Groats and the town of Thurso and Wick, you would have had to have taken a ferry boat across this stretch of water until the bridge that was stood beneath now, the Keswick Bridge, was erected and opened in 1982. And it meant that it saved a detour of around 20 miles around the head of the Beauly Firth. It's over a kilometre long, and it meant that the area to the north of the Inverness opened up economically, and today it's a commuter belt for the city itself. But this bridge provided some engineering difficulties for the civil engineers because, of course, it's built right across the Great Glen fault. So they had to ensure on the northern side in the pillars that they had dampers. That meant if there were any earth tremors, even the most minor, the bridge wouldn't see any structural damage, and it wouldn't go out of alignment. So a rather unusual view of the Keswick Bridge there, and we're looking out towards the other side there, the area north of Inverness across the Moray Firth, and this is it, an area known as the Black Isle. And maybe I'll visit the Black Isle in a few weeks' time. I haven't quite made up my mind as to where we'll be going in 3 weeks' time yet. And here on the Black Isle is our journey's end. So we started with a lighthouse and we're going to end with a lighthouse. This is the lighthouse at a point called Chanonry Point. And again, it's built by those Stevenson brothers, the well-known family of lighthouse engineers. And this is a really popular spot for wildlife spotters, as a pod of dolphins live in the ocean just off the point here, and it's one of the best spots to get a sight of them. It looks a bit cold there on that particular day when I took that photo, and I know it was cold because I was on a dolphin watching trip, and this was May last year, and it was absolutely freezing out on that boat. And I was on a tour, and I had forgotten to bring my waterproofs. Everyone else had. And no sooner had we got out of the safety and the shelter of the harbour, I was extremely wet and cold for the rest of the day on that particular trip. So I learnt my lesson on that particular day. So that's Chanonry Point, and we'll get one last up close shot of the lighthouse itself, a rather better view of the lighthouse on a better day, or much warmer. I wish it had been like that on that particular day. I could have dried off. So, my friends, that's the end of this week's tour. I was going to say a lazy journey along the Great Glen, but a bit of a gallop. In just an hour, we've travelled, I don't know, about 70, 80 miles from one side of Scotland to the other side. I hope it's given you another flavour of everything that is on offer. Next week, we're going to head back to Loch Ness, so we'll be taking in much of the Great Glen again. But I'm going to do a trip all the way around Loch Ness, and particularly concentrate on the southern side, because there's some real hidden secrets on the south side of Loch Ness where so many people don't visit. It's a very different nature from the north side, Urquhart Castle, and the Nessie hunters. So I hope you will join me for next week's tour. Before we leave, I'd like to announce the winner of this week's photo prize. So it's that 1988 photo from Carol. I hope that brought back plenty of memories. Carol, I'll be in touch over the weekend to get your address so I can send you a little thank you prize that will wing its way to you in South Africa in the next week or so as a thank you for submitting those photos. And before you go, can I just ask you, when you get the follow-up email from me with a link to the video replay, if you could possibly give me some feedback, I really appreciate it. I'm tailoring each week's tour as I get some really helpful feedback each week. And that includes suggestions for future tours, future themes. So next week, it's around Loch Ness. The week after, it's going to be Inverness. But if you've got something that you particularly would like me to cover, then please do so. And then one last thing is to say, if you are on social media, on Twitter or on Facebook, I would be really grateful if you could share these tours to your friends and family, so that even more people can join us in future weeks. So I'm going to take another sip of my whiskey, and in doing so, say goodbye and haste ye back. Good night.